All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's Author Event Series. My name is Myra, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Serene Khader in conversation with Carol Hay. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Thank you for keeping your phones on silent during the event. There will be time for a Q&A, so get your questions ready. This event is being live streamed. Hello, YouTube. So if you'd like to avoid being recorded, just avoid this general line of vision. During the event, we'll have it shut off during the signing, so you don't have to worry about it then. If you haven't picked up your pre-ordered book, or if you'd like to buy a book, you can do so at the register, right back there with the yellow sign, after the event. Thank you for buying books with us and supporting both amazing authors and our store, so we can continue to make events like this one possible. Now, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's guests. Carol Hay is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at UMass Lowell. Carol's book, Think Like a Feminist, The Philosophy Behind the Revolution, has been called a crisp, well-informed primer on feminist theory, and a winning mix of scholarship and irreverence. It's been translated into French, Korean, Chinese, and German. Serene J. Khader is an American moral and political philosopher and feminist theorist. She is a professor and J. Newman Chair in the Philosophy of Culture at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, and the CUNY Graduate Center. She is the author of Decolonizing Universalism, a transnational feminist ethic and adaptive preference and women's empowerment, and, of course, Faux Feminism. Tonight, we are here to celebrate Faux Feminism, why we fall for white feminism, and how we can stop. An incisive examination of why the pillars of feminism have eroded, and how all women, not just the #girl bosses, can rebuild them. After over 175 years, the feminist movement, now in its fourth wave, is at risk of collapsing on its eroding foundation. In Faux Feminism, Khader advocates for another feminism, one that doesn't overwhelmingly serve white, affluent girl bosses. With empathy, passion, and wit, Khader invites the reader to join her as she excavates the movement's history and draws a blueprint for a more inclusive and resilient future. Khader's critical inquiry begets a new vision of feminism, one that tackles inequality at the societal, non-individual level, and is ultimately rooted in community. Please welcome Serene Khader and Carol Hay.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I, for one, am thrilled to be here talking to Serene about this book. It's really hard to write a book like this, and it's really hard to write a book like this as well as Serene has managed. It's an incredible feat. I think as academics, we sort of get used to writing in one particular way, and when you branch out and start writing for a larger audience, all of the tricks that you've honed over the years get thrown out, and you have to learn something new. And I think that Serene has done it really, really impressively. So it's, I think this is a deceptively complex book. I think there's a lot of really, really interesting theory going on here, both her own theory and then also the theory of so many different feminists, especially feminists of color, whose work she's really amplifying. So I think it's a masterpiece in that regard, and I'm thrilled to be here talking to you about it.
I'm thrilled to be here talking to you, Carol. Thank you so much for doing this. If you read the acknowledgments, you will know that Carol was a big part of what convinced me to write a book for a popular audience. So thank you also, Carol. I'm calling you Karen. I hope that's not a Freudian slip. Thank you, Carol, for making that happen and for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
I'm really excited to talk about this stuff. So I'm going to do my best to restrict my questions to things that I think you folks might be interested in. So if I slip up and go nerdy philosopher, you can just start throwing pieces of paper at me or something. Because yeah, there really is just so much really interesting deep philosophy in here. But I also just think that there's a way of understanding the feminist movement that is more broadly accessible, and that Serene gives us a really, really great introduction into. So that's what I want to talk about here. So I'm going to kind of bop around and ask you a variety of questions and give you, something maybe you all don't know is that philosophers express respect by disagreeing with each other, right? So like the ultimate form of respect is to tell someone how wrong you think they are and why. So if it seems like I'm being mean, I'm just being a philosopher. I promise she doesn't take it personally. We're friends. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is how I think you very convincingly argued that the ideal of freedom, right, especially neoliberal individualist choice rhetoric, right, can and has led feminists to some really bad places. So in part, I'm going to invite you to kind of talk the audience through that argument. But first, I want to kind of introduce the contrast that you set up, right? So you set up this contrast between the freedom rhetoric, right, that is very, very common in a lot of feminist arguments, both feminist arguments out in the political world, in the public world in general, but also in the philosophical world. And you contrast this freedom rhetoric with equality, right? And so I think you very convincingly show the way that freedom rhetoric can go astray. But one of the things I kind of want to press you on is something you admit at various points, which is that equality rhetoric can also be misused, right? So I kind of, if you could kind of talk through the pitfalls of both and why you think that if we have to choose one, you'd rather go with equality. And then maybe a further question would be, do you think we have to choose one? Or maybe can we go with both?
Great. So because I didn't read and not everybody has read the book, I'll just explain a little bit about what the view that I offer is that Carol's responding to, and then I'll respond to the criticism. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was that I thought we were in this political moment where there was really kind of a critical mass of people who were interested in feminism, first of all, right? The book opens by saying feminism is at this crossroads where, for the first time in American history, the majority of American women identify as feminists. Feminism is incredibly popular. In that same moment, we see kind of two things going on. One, and this is kind of the positive reason for writing the book, is I think there is a growing awareness that strands in the feminist movement have excluded non-elite women or have harmed them, and an increasing awareness that various kinds of bad feminism, like white feminism, neoliberal feminism, white savior feminism, whatever, are bad. And so I wrote this book partly to offer an explanation of, well, you know that white feminism is bad, or you kind of heard this, but what is it that makes it bad, right? Like, what's the problematic idea? And the idea being that, like, kind of once we figure out what the idea that is causing harm is, like, what's a better idea that we can adopt to have a better movement that is less guilty of serving the interests of elite women at the expense of other people. And so a big part of my argument in the book is that these faux feminisms, and what I call feminisms for the few, are really united by this understanding of feminism as a movement for individual freedom. So this is kind of where Carol's question is coming from. I want to say that sort of both in the history of feminism and kind of out there in the ether is this view that feminism is a movement to free individual women from social expectations. And I think we see that in all different kinds of places, like, but one of the things I really also want to do in the book is say that this is not the only way to think about the goals of feminism, nor has it, like, historically been the primary way. And so part of the goal of the book also is to introduce people kind of very early on to an alternative way of thinking about what the moral goal of feminism is. It's a way of thinking about it that I think has been centered especially by women of color and women in the labor movement, but not exclusively by them. And certainly plenty of white women have been part of this ideal too. The alternative way of thinking about it is the way that kind of bell hooks articulated it in 1984, that feminism is about opposition to oppression, and oppression is not the same thing, and this is really central to my book, as deprivation of individual freedom. Oppression is a system that affects groups of people and positions them in hierarchies relative to each other. And I think this is something that we are able to acknowledge really readily when we think about things like capitalism and white supremacy, right? Like, we don't say those things are bad because they deny freedom to individual people, right? We're pretty aware in those kinds of cases that what we're fighting against is like structures that create hierarchy and that create hierarchy among groups. But somehow, feminism is often thought about as doing something different, and arguably, but I think, certainly there's a story that we can even tell about, I'm getting asked about white women in the election a lot recently, for example. This idea that feminism is not a movement for a group of people and that it's not about upending hierarchy has historically and really, I think, allowed various groups of people with a lot of privilege to sort of go rogue and treat advancing their own interests as though they are advancing the interests of all women and gender expansive people. So that's kind of the argument that Carol is responding to. And so Carol's question is, you're criticizing the idea that feminism is a movement for individual freedom. Can't all ideals be co-opted in this way, including the ideal that you offer? And I think the short answer to my question, and you might not like this, is I actually don't think that this is just a story about co-optation. Like, it's not the case that that privileged women using, thinking that they're advancing their own interests, advance the interests of all women. Like, that isn't just a case of them misusing rhetoric about freedom. Although in the book, I certainly describe some cases that you might want to think about as misuse. So if I'd read today, I would have read, the book opens with this anecdote about Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearing, where if any of you remember that kind of political moment, she, the conservative theater around her appointment really described her as she's a new kind of woman that defies gender expectations, and she doesn't let anyone tell her what to do, and she's so high powered because she's able to have 7 children and be this girl boss type of figure. And so you might say about those kind of cases, that those are co-optation, right? That she's really just pretending to be a feminist when she's saying I'm a feminist because I chose this, no one can judge me, whatever. But I actually think those things are really on a continuum with things that feminists are already saying. I think it's actually, I think many people in the room who are already feminists, including myself, have probably found themselves saying before something like feminism is about not judging women's choices, feminism is about respecting women's choices. And I don't think we get to just kind of stand back and say without another moral vision, right? We don't just get to say oh, those Amy Coney Barrett's choices are bad choices, right? They are, feminism has to be about something more than that. If there's a reason to criticize Amy Coney Barrett when she gets up there and says I'm a new kind of feminist. But I think the other reason I think it's not a story about co-optation, and this has been kind of a deep part of my philosophical work for a long time, is that I think it is true, once you recognize that oppression is about groups of people, more privileged members of groups of people have incentives to sell out the other members of the groups in order to advance their interests. So I think, to put it in the terms that the Jules LeBron meme does, right? There's always room for somebody who wants to be not like the other girls, right? And so I think that is part of, this isn't something that isn't part of a rhetoric, of the idea that feminism is about individual freedom. If you think it's only about individual freedom, you're not gonna be able to escape that problem, because people can use their freedom to do whatever they want, and people who are more privileged have good reasons to use their freedom to do things that help them and don't help other members of their group.
Yes to all of those things. I want to press you a little if I can, and in part, so I got my notes kind of divided into various sections, and one of the sections is where I want to invite Serene to talk to you all about the arguments behind certain phrases that when I read them, I freaked out. I don't know if you do this when you're reading a book and you find just a nugget of a phrase that you know is never going to leave your brain. This book is full of them. So in part, I want to kind of just invite Serene to talk about some of them. And the first one, I think, kind of connects up to this point, in the sense that I do think that, or rather, I didn't read you as saying that feminism is never about asking people to examine the social expectations that they're faced with, right? So I think you're right that if that's the only thing we're doing, then we're stuck in this kind of like, you know, consumerist individual model where we can't actually judge what people are doing, and then it ends up being a kind of facile relativism or even nihilism, right? We don't want to go there, right? But at the same time, sorry, just a note here. Right, so you've got this line, and so apparently it's from an Indian feminist named Nivedita Menon, and she says that feminism is like hitting the reveal formatting button. Right? And so that the experience of becoming a feminist is right where you reveal the formatting and you see all the, you know, weird stuff in your Word doc. And I read that as right, this recognition, right, that feminist consciousness can and does involve interrogating social expectations. And so I wanted to invite you to talk about
that. Definitely. And I love that quote too. Like Menon basically says, like, many of us come to and I'm sure many people in the room have this experience where when you first became a feminist, suddenly like all of these things lit up about the world that you had not noticed before, right? Like you thought you were free, and then suddenly like the formatting of the document appears and you realize like actually I've been socialized in all of these ways that I was not aware of and that are causing a problem. And so I want to say, like, I think it's very true that a lot of us come to feminism from that kind of experience. But I think also the fact that we come to feminism from that experience doesn't mean that it actually tells us the truth of what's wrong with the formatting. I think that like there's no way of avoiding being formatted. Like the real problem that for feminism is that the formatting is creating a world where some people matter more than others, and where all of us are feeding into this system where some people matter more than others, and often don't even realize that that's what we're doing. So another kind of strand, even though you didn't ask directly about this, but like where is this concern about like we're always formatted coming from? Like partly it's coming from the fact that like as a philosopher, like it just seems true once you think about it that there is no way to not be socialized. But a deep motivation for me in the book is also my experiences as a woman of color who just does not identify with this kind of understanding of freedom. And so one really important thread in the book is the idea that women of color are often pointing out that like traditions and communities can actually be like important sources of resistance to oppression. They can have a lot of positive value in our lives. Like one of the stories, I mean, I talk about it a lot in the context of colonialism, and that's something I'll just say. Like one thing you might not expect looking at the title of this book and like that it's a book for a general audience, there's a chapter about colonialism dropped into the middle of this book that seems like it's largely about feminism in the United States. But to tell a more US focused story, one of the stories I tell in the introduction is Mickey Kendall's story in Hood Feminism in the chapter that is called like The Hood Hates Smart People. And the story that she tells there is like, I was a very promising young Black woman, and I actually received a ton of support from my community for my academic excellence. But when I entered sort of the more like white world, the story that was told to me was like that I needed to escape my community. And actually, like if you look into the rhetoric and the design of many kind of like achievement gap closing programs, like the story that's built into them is like you have to separate this low income child of color from their peers because their peers are dragging them down and like preventing them from achieving. So, and another story that I tell about this kind of thing from my own experience is about when I had my second child kind of in the depths of the pandemic, and my dad came to visit me, and I asked him, like, what do you think is the main difference between like what it's like to parent here and what it's like to parent in India? And his response was one that might surprise folks, which was like, basically, it is so much harder here. Why is it so much harder here? Because here, the parents are alone to take care of children, And there's a deep understanding that it's everybody in the community's job to take care of people who are parents. So those are kind of two examples of why, like, I think individual freedom is important, of course, but I think that, like, that idea can't tell the whole story, partly because it can be used by privileged people, but also that a certain kind of individual freedom that we often find ourselves talking about, like, it might not exist, it might not be worth having anyway, and it also is often something that is particularly not appealing to people from communities of color, and that sometimes end up serving to undermine women of color in particular's relationships with their communities.
Okay, I have another category of question, and this is one of the nights when you get to ask to do these things like this. It's like, oh, this is what I want to hear when I go to a book reading. And one of the things I definitely want to do whenever I have a chance to meet an author is get them to spill the tea about stuff that's kind of hinted at, right? And so I think it's a really fun opportunity to just actually, get them to tell you more. And so there are two things in this category. I'm going to ask you about one of them now. So one of the things that Serene does is tell this story about an article that you wrote with your spouse about what it was like to parent, specifically during the pandemic, right? And it was a great piece. I remember reading it and loving it then. And one of the things you argued was that you called it the daddy dividend, right? Which was basically as a man, if you were seen doing basic parenting tasks, you're seen as a superhero. And if you're a woman, it's just impossible to do enough, right? So you call this the daddy dividend, you wrote it with your spouse, and it sounds like the two of you had a lot of examples of that. But you dropped this line where you said you had a particular, because your spouse got like fan mail, and you got hate mail about this piece, right? So it was like on a meta level confirming what it is you were talking about, right? And so I want to know if you're willing to tell us what that email, because you said you got one particular email on Mother's Day.
Yeah, I was gonna be like, you left out that it was on
Mother's Day. So I want to hear about the Mother's Day hate mail.
Yeah, so we wrote this, so I'll say something about how this ties into the big picture of the book in a minute, but the story is that we kind of invented this concept called the daddy dividend to refer to the fact that men get a lot of praise for doing things that are very basic kind of parts of parenting. Like, I remember when our daughter was born, like, I remember one day he went, and I think this appears in the daddy dividend article, like, he was just walking around Brooklyn, like, that's where I'm from, like, carrying the baby who was asleep, and people kept giving him free stuff. Like, he was like, they like gave him, like, he went to one place and they were like, here's a free coffee because you're the best dad in the world. And meanwhile, also, like, I think people who have kids, when we have kids and women of color and like other types of people who have kids who don't meet this, like, this white normative model that my spouse at least appears to be, like, will have had the experience of people criticizing your parenting all the time when you're out in public. But he's constantly praised. And I'll just say, like, another more recent, like, activist version of this is he is on the board of a climate activism organization of parents that, like, we mostly met on the playground. And he just moved on to the board after kind of just hanging out in the organization for a long time. And I guess the first night he was on the call, they were like, it's our first dad, right? It's the first dad we've ever had on the board. So how does this fit into the book as a whole? Well, I mean, one reason that kind of story is happening is that, one, the baseline for men is incredibly low, and the data show that in general, men participate in housework and care work at a much lower level than people anticipate, in a way that's far short of equality. And one of the reasons that happens, people theorize, is that men compare themselves to other men instead of comparing themselves to what, if they have a partner who's a woman, what the partner is doing. So you can see how it would happen that, like, in a world that's really far from equality, if the other dads are like, don't even know what their kid's dentist's name is or something, and then you are the dad who knows what your kid's dentist's name is, you might think like, oh, okay, I'm doing more than enough. But the real question that I think that needs to be asked is, like Darcy Lockman, who writes about this a lot, she says, like, you should ask the question, are you being fair to your wife, right? And like, that's actually a very different question from the question of, are you doing as much as other dads? That becomes a part of the book because, I'm criticizing the idea that feminism is a movement for individual freedom, and I think one of the places that ends up really not serving people well is that it makes it seem like feminist change can happen by only like empowering women and not making men change. And I think that has a lot of sort of dark sides. But I mean, one of the big dark sides is failing to see the sort of exhaustion epidemic that is facing especially like American women with children. Like, if you start with the idea that, like, for example, like feminism is about freedom from the home and the ability to pursue a career, well, that doesn't do anything about the fact that some of the like housework still needs to be done, children still need to be taken care of, this work needs to be still needs to happen. And so what's actually happening in the status quo is two things. One is women are doing more than men, and they are now like more tired. We're more tired than we were several generations ago, and this is like a real kind of public health problem and a problem for justice too. But the other thing we see that's important for like issues around women of color, issues around class, is that because we have like one of the sort of mainstream feminisms that exists like doesn't really care about or acknowledge the need for care work to happen, the other way to solve this problem is to hire another woman, usually a less advantaged woman than you, to pick up the slack of this work that needs to be done. And one thing that I think is really important to emphasize, because I think sometimes when people talk about it, like the idea, like the buck sort of stops there, but it's actually like, no, like probably the woman that you hired has this problem herself, right? Like, she probably also has caregiving responsibilities, and she probably is passing them to somebody further down the economic ladder, often somebody who is like, the people who are doing house cleaning and like the lowest wage forms of care work, like their work isn't even acknowledged to be work, they have no labor protections, they're paid extremely terribly. And so this story, I think, is one of the kind of most damning stories for freedom feminism, right? Like the idea that like freeing people from social expectations isn't going to do anything to redistribute this work. And unless we redistribute this work, like the most vulnerable women are going to continue to be exploited. But in terms of the tea of the email, I actually don't even remember what it said. I was just like, so like my spouse just got all this fan mail and then I got nothing. And then on Mother's Day, I woke up and I got this email, and it was just like, it was along the lines of, have you ever considered that it's really important for men to receive this praise and that they won't, well, they're not going to do the work without the praise, so aren't you just making things worse by calling out the praise?
Great. Okay. Let's go back to phrases guaranteed to stick in your brain. Okay. Here's another one. This is something Serene writes at the end of the book, and in some ways, I think it captures one of the major strands that you're talking about here. So you say, wins for elite women won't trickle down, but fights for the most marginalized might trickle up. And so if you could talk a little bit more about that, about the concept of the theory of the Vanguard Center, I think that's really kind of key. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing it up, because I think it is really important to the positive message of the book. So, I spend a lot of the book kind of criticizing the idea that feminism is about individual freedom, but the last couple chapters are really about what we could think instead, and about movements that have actually successfully thought something else instead. And one of the things that I try to say really unites those movements is this idea that is really central to Black feminism, and I think is really kind of the intellectual hallmark of Black feminism, which is the idea that when you are kind of figuring out a political strategy, you should pick the strategy that advances the interests of the most vulnerable member of your group, right? Like, so, and I think when you actually think about kind of how we teach our children about feminism in many cases, or like the popularity of girl boss feminism, the dominant theory is really the opposite, right? Like our kids read, and so the book opens with the story of my realizing that I'm reading a book to my child that is the same book that Amy Coney Barrett is referencing to young girls. But I have seen, like, in my children's curriculum, and I remember this, right? Like, you get taught about, like, well, this woman was the first president, well, we don't have a first president, like, this woman was the first president of another country, right? And this woman was the first astronaut, and this woman was the, like, discovered radium, right? And this, and so we have this, like, the feminism that I think gets kind of, like, taught to us and is, like, distilled into our culture is a feminism that's like, women can have these outstanding accomplishments too, like, let's just fight to make sure that, like, women can have these outstanding accomplishments too. And I think you really see that, and kind of a dark realization of that is in sort of girl boss feminism and where that went, which is kind of at the end of the 2010s. And I think you still see versions of this. I think the term girl boss has just kind of gone out of fashion. But you see women who make it to kind of like, are very successful in business, make it to the top of the corporate ladder. And then there were all these exposés during the fall of the girl boss of them like treating their employees extremely terribly, saying things like, I work so hard, and then people are like, how is your toilet clean? And then they say like, well, there's some nice lady that cleans my toilet, I don't know her name, right? This is a real example. It's not one that I'm making up. And along with that, you even saw them describing this as still kind of a victory for feminism, right? Like, I'm on my hustle, I take no prisoners, right? Like, and even saw people using rhetoric about how it's unfeminist to judge women as cover for this kind of behavior. So you saw them saying things like, well, nobody would say this about a man. And so one of the things I think we can learn from something like Girl Boss is, well, like, if it was gonna trickle like down now, like now we have a test case and it didn't trickle down, right? Like what happened instead is, people got to the top of the ladder and decided that they wanted to, like, they were happy to pull up the ladder behind them if they even saw that that's what they were doing. But this theory of the Vanguard Center, which is kind of a central idea of Black feminism, offers another alternative, right? Like, who says feminism has to be about focusing on the accomplishments of women at the top? Like, what if we think instead about how to make a world that's more just for the people at the bottom?
Yes, exactly. Okay, yeah, so that's another great quote. It's going to stick in your head, right? Wins for elite women don't trickle down. Justice for women at the margins might trickle up. There you go. You're not going to forget it. It's in there. You're done. All right, more tea.
Oh.
Okay. There's one of the early chapters, you have this really interesting section where you talk about East Germany and women behind the Iron Curtain. And apparently, so in Poland, East Germany, right, in these socialist countries, they did a bunch of social science, and they discovered that these women were having much better sex than women in Western countries, which of course it was completely against the narrative, right, that life in these countries where there is no freedom, right, because these people like equality, right, life must be terrible and full of potatoes and drudgery, right, and so it seems like the social science actually shows that, at least with respect to sex, and presumably with respect to other sort of measures of life satisfaction, is when we're actually doing a lot better. So you can just give us more details there, because it's super interesting.
Yeah, a bunch of the first chapter of the book is about the orgasm gap. Who's heard of the orgasm gap? Okay, several people have. In different audiences, people react differently. But basically, it's the idea that in sexual encounters between a man and a woman, men are much more likely to have an orgasm, but it also, I think, just refers to the fact that our kind of heteronormative and sexist cultural definition of sex takes male orgasm to be like that's a definition of a sexual encounter, but the orgasm of another person is not like a requirement of the sexual encounter. So I talk about the orgasm gap partly because it's fascinating and I think really like affects people's lives. But I think it's also a story of a case where like it's clear that focusing on freedom alone like isn't solving the problem. Sex is much less restricted than it was a generation ago, right? Like 2 generations ago, I think, like people like were not even, we're told that they couldn't have sex outside of marriage, right? And that was the social norm. Like that's clearly not where we are now. There's an incredible availability of porn now, right? Like so on one hand, like there's a lot more sexual freedom, but at the end of the day, like, does it matter if we're still like exercising our sexual freedom in a terrain where at the end of the day, like it still doesn't matter whether a woman has an orgasm. And so this quote that Carol is bringing up is actually from the research of Kristen Godsey, who is at the University of Pennsylvania. But she says, like, actually there have been cases in recent history where there isn't an orgasm gap or it's much smaller. And one of those sets of cases is in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, like where people were studying sex and they were studying sex because within their the socialist understanding was the idea that sex was part of health, it was a basic human need. So of course you're going to study it along with other health indicators. And there were cases there where women and men reported relatively equal levels of orgasm in a sexual encounter. And I bring up that story also partly to reveal how kind of the strategies that claim to be available to solve the orgasm gap now mostly seem to have the effect of not being useful to people who are vulnerable or exhausted, and B, seem to just mostly result in more work and become a way of telling a woman that she should work harder on herself. So in terms of the vulnerable thing, right, part of why I bring up the sex under socialism thing to say is sometimes some reasons that people may not be having satisfying sexual lives is that they are tired, their bodies are injured by difficult work, they and then if you add to that the actual, it's a weird sort of problem solution mismatch. Almost all writing about the orgasm gap says well, what should you do about this? Well, you should buy a jade egg and find some time to yourself to learn more about your body. So it is also just this, not everybody has time for that, especially in this background of exhaustion for women. There's actually a story in the book that someone tells of reading, I can't remember who tells it, but they're I was reading about starting your morning with orgasmic meditation, and I was reading this while I was serving breakfast to my toddler. So starting my morning with orgasmic meditation was not an option. But it's telling people that, that working harder on themselves is the way to solve a problem that really is not their problem. And also, it's making it seem like a problem that is really in other people and in the culture can be solved by individuals.
Yes, and I think that's an important theme that we see lots of different examples of. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll open it up to you folks. So this one's in the category of philosophers being mean to each other. Not really. But I do want to press you a little bit about the title. So it's Faux Feminism, Why We Fall for White Feminism, and How We Can Stop. And so in part, I want to invite you to talk about why you call it white feminism. I think we're agreed that there's an enemy, but I think calling this enemy just white feminism is a kind of almost a failure of intersectionality that your book just doesn't have, right? This is probably the most intersectional book I've ever read, right? And so I guess, so it's,
Thank you.
no, I mean it, it's a tour de force, it really is. And so to call it white feminism, I think sort of undersells who the enemy is, in a sense. Because, again, to be clear, this is not me, the white feminist, being, don't say mean things about me. That's not what this is, okay? Right, but this is, again, sort of like pushing maybe all of us to think about exactly what this problematic form of feminism that takes up so much space in our collective consciousness actually is. It is white, it's true, but it's also classist, right? It's also racist, it's also colonialist, it's also ableist, it's also extraordinarily heteronormative. And transphobic and homophobic, right? So like we could call it why we fall for cis heteronormative feminism, right? Because like I think the limiting assumptions of this brand of feminism really are that most women, or the women who matter, the women we care about, are cis and are straight, right? And right, so the goals of the feminist movement are to like attend to the interests and problems of this privileged group of women, right? I really like how one of the themes, so sort of like, there's almost like action items that we get from this, which is I think really hard in a philosophy book, and you're really giving it to us. But one of the action items really is like, expect more from men. Men need to do better, right? We need to have better conceptions of masculinity. We need to hold men to a higher standard. But at least for, I think, increasingly more women, they're just not interested in the dudes at all, right? They've just rejected cis heteronormativity completely, right? And right, so like instead they're being sort of like, oh, men can't live with him, can't live without him, right, kind of thing, right? Right. I think like a lot of people who are resisting this kind of feminism, we call it white feminism, call it whatever it is, they're going beyond beyond these assumptions in other ways as well. So I guess it's important. Yeah, I want to sort of ask, why do you call it white feminism? And if you could change the title, would you call it? Would you come up with a different adjective?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I also wanted to say something about the cis heteronormativity part first, because obviously I think we should criticize cis heteronormativity, but I have a kind of different gloss on the like women want nothing to do with men kind of thing, which is that, of course, like women should have the ability to renounce men, and people should have the ability to be in whatever kinds of relationships they want and that are fulfilling to them. But I actually think, like, when you look around, one, like, renouncing men is not going to, like, prevent you from being affected by the patriarchy. And I think, like, we see that a lot, for example, in, like, the fact that everyone is searching for 4B right now, right? And, like, it seems like some people in the room might not know what 4B is. 4B is a South Korean feminist movement that is about, it lists 4 things that you're supposed to renounce, like you renounce sex with men, you renounce childbirth, you renounce these other things. And I'm forgetting what the other 2 are. But marriage, right, and then does anyone know what the 4th one? You renounce dating. Okay, so there you renounce all of these various things with men. And that, oh my gosh, my chair has fallen apart. Sorry. Let's see if we're good. It's not on the slide. No, I can also just stand because we're almost done, but let's see. Okay, all right. So, no, I think I'm good. Yeah. I was just more afraid of falling down. So, on the one hand, of course, like, and especially in the context of South Korea, this is an amazing and like powerful and important movement. But this is a rise. Why are people searching for B right now? Well, they're searching for B right now because of this uptick in violent misogyny among Gen Z men that seems to have been unleashed since the election. And as much as one might think that one can protect oneself from violent misogyny by renouncing men, like, I don't think that's actually how the world works. And in fact, like, violent misogyny loves to target queer and trans people too. So this is like, yeah, so I actually see this like idea of renouncing men as like, it doesn't solve the problem that men need to change for patriarchy to change. in terms of like what the title, like why is white feminism in the title? I think, look, part of the answer is just that like you have to have a book title and it can't take up 20 pages. White feminism is a known sort of concept, I think, especially among like other millennial and Gen Z people, right? Like it's come to describe a type of feminism that serves the interests of elite people like over everyone else. So partly it's just to plug into a vibe. It's to acknowledge the tradition, especially of like women of color writing recently critically of white feminism, like Nikki Kendall, like Rafia Zakaria, like Ruby Hamad. Also though, and I think, you know, we haven't talked that much about the colonialism part of the book, but I think one of the sort of unique things about this book is that it talks about capitalism and white supremacy together. And like, I don't think you always see that. And I think part of why I'm able to see that is because I'm a scholar of colonialism. And so I think the real sort of deep history about how white feminism gets sort of wrapped up in capitalism is partly because the history of capitalism in the West has always been a history of whiteness. And so yes, like it would be more precise to add in a bunch of other things, but I also think that white feminism is a powerful term that captures the fact that racism is this like structuring force in especially US society and a structuring global force that's tied up with capitalism and also, and I mean, tied up with heteronormativity also in all of these ways that we could talk about more if people want to. I could say more about that, but I think maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Let's open it up to you.
Do they need to use the mic?
Are we gonna do next for?
Just because they're live streaming, they may want you to have a mic. Yeah. No, sorry.
So you talk about women being exhausted, but again, it's always limited to, and I don't mean to offend parents, but single women are exhausted too.
Yes.
We're doing the civic work that the mothers can't do. We're upholding the other parts of family. You know, often it is the single sibling, whether it's a man or a woman, who's left with mom and dad or whomever, who is doing that extra.
Yeah.
So like if I've always theorized that if single women all died out, the world would collapse. What do you think about that?
No, I love that point, and I think I think yes, A, you're just right, and then I think B, what it's really a call for is widening the concept of care labor and women's labor that is unacknowledged and that's like underlying everything, right? Like you brought up that single women are often caring for aging parents, but I think you also brought up like they're doing all this community work, right? Like it's, I mean, the work of even things like, so social reproduction theorists, for example, talk about things like going to funerals and organizing them, like going to weddings, like cooking for people, creating these spaces for people, like actually the way that society is like making us able to interact in a way where we care for each other, where we know each other over long periods of time, where social interactions are easy, where we know who our community is. And like, those things don't happen by magic. Like, they happen through emotional and care labor of various kinds that isn't seen as such. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And then I think what it's an invitation to think about is that there are also all these other kinds of labor that are assigned to women that are absolutely necessary to the functioning of society that no one talks about. Like, one example I do talk about in the book that's like just kind of a throwaway is like when you're expected to be the one who always plans the office birthday parties and like and bring the office gifts, right? But it's like, actually, you know, it matters to the workplace of your office, like if somebody's noticing the birthdays, if people get a party, if the gifts are bought. But like, think about, like, I challenge you kind of in your own lives, like, think about who in your workplace or who in your friend group is doing that actual work. It's work, it takes time, it's absolutely necessary, it's thought of, like, it's often not, I mean, we talk about care work being not visible, but this is another layer of invisible, and so, yeah, I think this fits the analysis, and I really appreciate this extension of it. You don't want to ask a question? I scared you with the microphone. Yeah.
I'm interested in, well, it seems like a lot of white feminism, whatever, is I want to be able to be the boss like the boys. And once I'm a boss like the boys, I can act like the boys, and I can disregard all the people below me. And I don't have to know who cleans my toilet. And some schlep will pick up my kids and whatever. So there's still this denigration of what is seen as women's work. Now I know that historically it's been women's work because, I don't know, the men were out there hunting or fighting or whatever they were doing. Is there a way we can ever change that idea of, well, honey, you take care of the dishes and the ordering the toilet paper and buying the birthday party gifts and ordering the carpool because it's beneath me to, this is a legitimate job. Taking care of the elderly is a legitimate job. I have 5 children, none of my siblings have children. I'm taking care of mom, this person in the back.
Is your microphone on?
I don't know.
I think
I
it
can
is.
rant though, I can get on a soapbox. So, I'm not technical. So, I guess I'm just wondering, is there any hope for ever de-gendering the roles?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely hope, and then maybe in a minute I'll say something about the patriarchy and wanting to be like the boys part, but like, I think there's absolutely hope, and I think part of the answer is just like you pay people for the labor, right? And you make it count as, like you say, that doing this work is a job that deserves labor protections like another job. And so I think this is maybe a case where starting from the people at the bottom has actually a lot of potential to trickle up and out, because it's like paying and giving fair wages to care workers and domestic workers, like once people start having to pay for something and once they have to start paying for it fairly, right, like pay the thing what it's worth, not what it is worth like because of it being devalued, and when there's a workforce of people who have been socialized or forced to do it for free, I think that's where the real change is going to happen.
And I would just jump in. This is something that people can actually do.
Yes.
Right? You can ask yourself, how much am I paying my house cleaner? This is what she asks. How much is it actually worth? And just pay her what it's worth. You can do that for your babysitters, for your nannies, right? And it's a political act. And the thing is, if you do it, right, then your neighbors, like, once she knows that she can charge this for you, well, then she can go to her other clients and say, well, this person's charging, paying me this, and like, you make a material difference in people's lives. And it's like, it's a small thing, but it really does possibly trickle up.
Well, and I mean, the book kind of ends on some of these. You can support the organizations that are domestic worker organizations that are fighting for things like unionization for domestic workers, and for them not to be in legal loopholes. I mentioned the names of several in the book. One of them is the National Domestic Workers Alliance. But one of the things I go into in the book is actually that the history of domestic worker organizing is something that has happened kind of across the 20th century, mostly in movements run by Black women. And maybe this speaks to another thing about the white feminism part, which is like, actually like, the first domestic workers in this country were enslaved Black women. So it's also not a coincidence that Black women's organizing has really prioritized this particular issue.
We have time for 2 more questions. If anyone has them, now's the time to be brave.
when you talk about women of color, do you think that there's a hierarchy within this label of women of color? And also when you talk about community, isn't there always hierarchy in what the community? So,
Yeah. So to the first question, like, is there a hierarchy within the term women of color? I think there absolutely can be. And one of the things I talk about in the book is Crenshaw's original article about intersectionality. And I talk about how there are actually sort of two metaphors in that article. Everyone has been, Kim Crenshaw is the theorist who coined the term intersectionality. And everyone is obsessed with it, rightly, with the metaphor of the intersection, right? With the woman of color who is hit by two different cars, or like the car of white supremacy and the car of sexism. But when you look at her body, you can't be like, oh, well, this broken rib was caused by white supremacy, but this broken knee was caused by patriarchy. So the other image, and this is the answer to your question about hierarchy in Crenshaw's article, is the image of the basement, where she says, like, we should also imagine that you can imagine the world as like a house where all the oppressed people are in the basement. And within the basement, where people are stacked on top of each other and standing on each other's shoulders. And so I think like, to me, one of the most powerful things in that article is that the image of the basement really tells us like what the point of practicing intersectionality in the first place is, right? Like, I think sometimes people talk about intersectionality as though it's just like we need to acknowledge that everybody has these like different and special experiences, which is also true. But the reason we want to practice intersectionality, I think at the end of the day, and I think she also says this, is so that we don't develop movements that only get the people at the top of the basement out of the basement, which is one way you might think about what white feminism has done and aims to do. So is there hierarchy among women of color? Like, yes, clearly, right? Like, why would we deny that? I think it's important to actually figure that out in our movements, like who are they working for, who are they not working for? Is there hierarchy in communities? You said, is there always? I'm not sure about the always, but is there hierarchy in most existing communities? Like, definitely. And I don't mean to deny that. And I think one of the important things about feminisms led by women of color is that they are often both trying to preserve community and to end the hierarchy in the community, right? Like, one way to think about it is you can recognize hierarchy in community and then you can go one of two ways. You can kind of say, like, so, like, F the community, right? Like, I'm gonna go off by myself. Or you can say, like, community is really important. We need to find a way to restructure our community in a way that's less that's less hierarchical. And I guess I see myself as advocating for the latter. And I think there's lots of models of the latter. A graduate student whose dissertation committee I was just on about what it means to be Indigenous brought up this really interesting example of like Indigenous communities that think that like when a child enters the community, like part of the community's job is to accommodate itself to them, right? Like the child may come into the world very and like exercise its freedom in a way that's very different from what people expected. Like, what do we do about that? Well, maybe one way to respond to that is to have a social norm that says, like, part of what it means to be a community is to be non-hierarchical and welcome things that one has not traditionally welcomed or that one does not always expect.
First of all, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I'm very overwhelmed of course,
course.
with everything, all the concepts. I try to study more feminism from my own human development. I think you're very fortunate to have a partner that supports your work and you being a mother, etc. I love the daddy dividends concept. I didn't know about this. So I'm gonna share with my partner. I love, you mentioned Bell Hooks. I love her book Communion. Is one of my favorite books ever. And she was heterosexual, right? And she talks about that in the community inside the feminism movement and also how many women of her colleagues also changed their sexuality to explore something else because they were not satisfied with their regular heteronormative relationships. But something that I'm always like thinking about, my partner is also very feminist, and I'm curious, right, when you are bringing those topics inside your household, just talking to him, what is the reception of these concepts around his friends? Like, what does your husband bring to you, or like what you discuss with him around that? Because I think it's so hard. Yes, I love my partner, I love how he thinks, but I don't know how it is around his masculine friend. Like, so I'm curious to know how those are things discussed in your house with your husband. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think in my particular case, I think my husband has kind of always been the guy that is telling other guys that like some of the things that they're saying are not okay. Like, there's been all of these memes that are circulating post the Your Body My Choice stuff about things that men can say if somebody posts a meme like that and says they can just say something like that's kind of a messed up thing to say, right? Like, that already intervenes in the normalization of this Your Body My Choice stuff. So I think in a certain sense my spouse has always been that person, but I don't want to pretend that he was like always as feminist as he is now before he met me, right? Like, so there's, I think, a learning curve that probably most men have to go through. What have his conversations been like? I mean, I think it has caused friction with some people, I think, is the short answer. And I think that's maybe a hard thing to accept, that like, and I think, of course, we want to think that like, it's easy and you're never gonna lose any friends when you try to stand up for what the right thing is. I do think that some of his relationships with men have changed, but I also think he has discovered a lot of new kinds of relationships with men that might not have been available to him if like he were not interested in feminism. Including that, like, he now has like a dad's group that like, you only hear about mom's group, right? But like, he has a dad's group that like, and their joke is that like, they're ostensibly meeting to talk about football, but the football is on in the background and they're just talking about their feelings. So I think, and how hard parenting is. So I think that, like, with any kind of transition, there's some friction, there's difficult learning that has to happen. But I also think that it can open up new kinds of like relationships and connections and deepen like men's relationships to each other.